Uniforms don't make you important, Morgan. Out here, you're just the girl who never was enough." My Aunt Marlene said it as if she were ordering another slice of pie, her voice cutting through the hum of family chatter inside the Pueblo Community Center on July 4th weekend. It was loud enough for the cousins behind her to pause mid-conversation and look at me. My hand froze around the plastic cup of lemonade I had just picked up. The word enough kept pulsing in my ears like an echo I had spent a lifetime trying to outrun. I felt the cold from the cup press through the thin layer of my glove, the glove that matched my Army service uniform, but inside that room, it might as well have been a costume to them. I stood there under strings of red, white, and blue balloons, watching Marlene tilt her head at me with a smile that did not reach her eyes. Behind her, the long tables were lined with patriotic cloths, potato salad bowls, and half-eaten pies. Somewhere near the front, someone started up an old country song, but every note felt distant. She said it again, slower this time, savoring it. Out here. The message was clear. Whatever I was outside this room never mattered in here. For a moment, I looked at my reflection in the metal drink dispenser, the uniform fitting just right. The badge polished my posture steady. 28 years old, seemingly calm. Yet inside the old sting returned the one born from years of being treated as the extra place setting at every family gathering. She stepped closer. "You know I am right, Morgan. You always act like you have done something special, but around here you are still the same. Never enough." I felt the familiar pressure in my chest, the one that used to silence me as a child, but not today. I lifted my eyes to hers and simply said, "Got it." The two words dropped like a stone between us. She laughed quietly as if my calm confirmed her opinion. "You always got it, and yet you never get anywhere." Around us, forks clinked against plates and chairs scraped lightly against the floor, but her voice carried above it all. I could sense the eyes on me waiting to see whether I would shrink the way I used to. Instead, a different thought rose, something quieter but sharper. Out here, they saw someone small. Out there, the world saw someone else entirely. My mind flashed to a cold morning stage at Fort Carson months earlier. Rows of soldiers stood in formation, while a medal was pinned to my uniform. I remembered the weight of it against my chest. The cameras from the base paper, the headline afterward in Army Times reading "Young Lieutenant Hale Saves NATO Exercise from Collapse." I remembered the handshake, the nod, the quiet respect of people who truly understood the cost of leadership under pressure. But none of that lived in this room, not in the eyes of the people who had already decided who I was long before I ever put on a uniform. I turned slightly, meaning to step away from Marlene, before I said something that would give her more satisfaction than she deserved. That was when I heard it, the sound of polished boots striking the tile floor just outside the double doors. Slow measured steps carrying authority in every strike. Conversations softened around us as if the air itself shifted. Someone near the buffet whispered, "Is that a soldier?" Another voice followed, "Wait. Why would someone in uniform be here?" The doors opened wide as sunlight spilled across the entrance. 3 figures stepped inside, moving with the unmistakable precision of higher command. The one in front wore a star on his chest. Brigadier General Harrington, my commanding general, the same man who had pinned the medal on me. His presence in this small community hall felt unreal for a breath. He scanned the room once the way commanders do, taking in exits walls people. Then his eyes locked directly on me. He did not hesitate. He walked past the tables, past the stunned relatives, past the mural of fireworks painted on cardboard toward where I stood. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even Marlene straightened slightly, unsure what she was seeing. He stopped just inches from me and nodded with recognition. That simple nod carried more validation than every word my family had ever withheld. In that second, my aunt's voice echoed again in my memory. "Uniforms don't make you important." Yet here stood a general walking straight toward me. I met his eyes, and a thought rose clear and calm. "She says uniforms don't make me important. He is the reason the whole army thinks otherwise. Has anyone ever told you that what you worked for means nothing? Tell me in the comments if that hit a nerve. I grew up in the Hale house in Pueblo, where the walls carried everyone's story except mine. And even now, when I think back to those years, the first image that returns is the living room lined with framed pictures of Ethan, smiling his perfect golden boy smile, while every photo of me was either cropped poorly or tucked into the corner of a shelf that no one dusted. And I remember standing there at 8 years old, wondering how a person could be present in a room and still feel missing. On Ethan's birthdays, the house would transform into a parade of balloons and confetti, with a grill smoking in the backyard and relatives pouring through the door with gifts stacked higher than my head. And every time I reached for a chair or tried to join a conversation, someone would hand me another jacket to hold, because apparently the one thing I was trusted with was standing quietly near the entryway, while people dropped coats into my arms without looking at my face. I learned early that silence kept the peace, so I stayed quiet even when it hurt. And one afternoon, when I proudly carried home a test paper with a bright A+ at the top, I held it out to my aunt, thinking maybe this time she would see me. Yet she barely blinked before saying that grades did not matter in the real world and that I did not have the personality to go far anyway. And the words slid under my skin like a cold draft from an open window. My mother gave a soft smile, the kind adults give when they do not plan to intervene. And my father only said good job before turning back to a game on the TV, and I felt my throat tighten, because it became clear that approval in our family had an assigned direction, and I was not on the receiving end of it. The night that shaped me most happened when I was around 10, and Marlene had been drinking more than usual, and her voice rose like a storm as she argued with her husband in the hallway. And I still remember Ethan's frightened face as I pulled him away to the kitchen, trying to shield him from whatever was happening behind that door. And then suddenly Marlene appeared with eyes blazing, and without warning, she slapped me so hard my cheeks snapped sideways. Before I could even understand what happened, she announced loudly that I had pushed her first and that I had violence in me. And the room filled with adults who all turned to look at me as if I had truly done something monstrous, and my parents accepted her version in a heartbeat, because keeping the peace mattered more than keeping the truth. I ran to the bathroom and stared at the red imprint on my cheek in the mirror, while laughter from the living room floated down the hall as if nothing had happened. And that was the night I learned that when I told the truth, it did not matter if the wrong person spoke louder. After that, I spoke less and less, because being unheard became easier than being mislabeled. And when Marlene visited, she always had a comment waiting for me like a rehearsed line, and she made sure I heard every word. She would sit in the kitchen sipping sweet tea and tell my mother that some children were destined for greatness, and some were just meant to fill space, and that Ethan carried the Hale name with pride, while I was just the extra piece that came with the box. I once passed the hallway when she said it again in a low voice to my mother that I would never be the one, and Ethan would carry this family name because I was simply extra. And the sentence hit me so squarely that I froze behind the corner, unable to breathe. My mother gave a small hum of agreement, the kind that felt like betrayal wrapped in politeness. And my father did not argue either. And in that moment, I understood my position in our home, not through rules, but through a mission. The Hale house ran on an unspoken ranking system, and Ethan always stood under the brightest light, while I was placed at the dimmest edge, and every family gathering reinforced it. At Thanksgiving, when relatives filled the dining room, they asked Ethan about his sports achievements and his big dreams, and then turned to me only to say, "You are so quiet, dear," as if silence were my defining achievement. I often sat at the kids' table even when I outgrew it, because someone had to make space for the adults who actually mattered, or so I overheard. My childhood became a long string of moments where I did everything right and still felt like a placeholder, someone who covered gaps rather than someone who belonged. I remember helping set up chairs for a summer barbecue and overhearing Marlene tell a neighbor that some children shine naturally and some just follow along, And when the neighbor asked about me, she waved her hand dismissively and said she helps out, and that was all. What they never understood is that I listened to everything, even when they thought I was invisible. I heard the jokes about how I was too sensitive, the remarks about how I needed to toughen up the comments, about how Ethan made the family proud, and I learned to fold my emotions small so no one could use them against me. In a typical American household, keeping the peace often meant not calling out cruelty, and anytime I tried to explain how something hurt me, the adults would say, "She is exaggerating" or "she is too dramatic." And eventually I stopped challenging them because fighting a narrative repeated long enough felt like trying to push back the tide. But something in me kept watch, quietly, storing every slight, every dismissal, like points on a map. And even though I did not know it, then each moment was shaping the spine I would one day stand on. The Hale family thought they were raising a child who would accept her place, yet every insult etched itself into a future I had not discovered yet. And while they believed their words were final, I felt something in me beginning to resist, quietly and steadily, like a rope pulled too tight. When I think back now, the girl who stared into the bathroom mirror with a handprint glowing on her cheek did not know she would become a soldier or that her name would one day carry weight far beyond Pueblo, Colorado. Yet she did know one thing with certainty, that the people who were supposed to protect her had chosen someone else, and that she would never forget that choice. By the time I reached 16, the Hale house felt smaller than it ever had, and every hallway seemed to echo with someone else's ambition, except mine. And even though I pretended to settle into the background, the quiet resentment in me was starting to pulse like a second heartbeat, and Pueblo High School offered the first places where I felt a crack of possibility, opening the kind of possibility that came from test scores and counselors who looked at you as if your future were not already written. My school counselor called me in one afternoon after reviewing my transcript, and she smiled in a warm, steady way that felt foreign to me, and said that with my grades, I could qualify for a partial scholarship at Colorado State University, especially in computer science, since I had shown an aptitude for technical work. For a moment, the air felt lighter, and I imagined a life where effort mattered. But before I could take that thought home, with hope, Marlene inserted herself into the conversation as if she were the gatekeeper of my potential. She had shown up at school to drop something off for Ethan, and as soon as she overheard what the counselor said, she leaned against the doorframe and smirked while she insisted that I was not college material and that the counselor should not put ideas in my head, because some kids do not have what it takes to survive real competition. And she said it with such casual authority that even the counselor's smile faltered. I kept my mouth shut because I had learned that arguing only made her voice louder, and once her version of the story existed, it became fact. Later that week, I walked into the kitchen for a glass of water and froze when I heard Marlene speak in her low conspiratorial tone, telling my parents not to waste savings on me and that girls like me drop out anyway, and that they should save their money for Ethan's graduate school, since he was the one who would make the family proud. My mother murmured that they did not have enough to support both kids, and my father sighed heavily and said Ethan's future was more predictable. And I remember gripping the counter so tightly, my fingers hurt because they were planning my ceiling without even asking me what I wanted. I backed away before they noticed me, and I carried that conversation like a bruise for days, feeling its dull ache every time I tried to imagine a path out. Weeks passed, and one afternoon at school, a group of Army recruiters set up a small table in the parking lot, handing out pamphlets to students on their way to the buses, and something about the crisp uniforms and structured confidence around them drew my eyes like gravity pulling. One recruiter noticed me standing off to the side and started talking about ROTC and the GI Bill and how the Army would pay for your education in exchange for commitment and discipline, and the moment he said discipline, my chest tightened, because discipline meant fairness and rules and systems that did not shift depending on someone's mood, and I realized I was craving a place where no one could rewrite the truth mid-sentence. He went on to describe the signal corps, and I felt an unexpected spark as he explained that communications kept missions alive, and that people who understood networks and coordination played a critical role even if they did not stand on the front line. Everything about it felt solid and logical and structured in a way my life had never been. So when he handed me a pamphlet, I took it without hesitation, tucking it behind my textbooks as if it were something fragile. I read it in secret that night under the thin yellow light of my bedroom lamp, and the idea crystallized quickly that if my family would not invest in my future, then I would find someone who would. A few days later at dinner, I gently mentioned that an Army recruiter had visited the school and that I was curious about ROTC, and before I even finished the sentence, Marlene laughed loud enough for the forks to clatter and asked if I planned to play soldier, because nobody was going to salute my attitude, and my parents chuckled as if she had made a harmless joke, but every word landed pointed and sharp. I discovered in that moment that pushing back only fed them, so I simply nodded and stored the rejection with all the others. That night, I filled out the ROTC interest form on my school computer lab and printed the paperwork the next day during lunch, then slipped it into my locker behind a stack of notebooks where no one would find it. It felt like the smallest rebellion, but also the first real step I had ever taken for myself. And while they continued to make plans for Ethan, I reviewed fitness requirements and scholarship details in secret, whispering a promise to myself that if they refused to believe in my future, I would become someone they never expected. By spring, the envelope from the ROTC office arrived at the school counselor's office, and when she handed it to me, her eyes sparkled with quiet pride, and she whispered that she hoped my family would be excited. I did not correct her. I simply opened the letter alone in the corridor, reading that I had been accepted into the program at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, and that my tuition would be largely covered if I fulfilled training requirements. My chest filled with a complicated mix of relief and determination and fear, but above all, there was a steady calm, because this was mine, in a way nothing else had been. I folded the letter neatly and slipped it into my backpack without telling a soul at home. At dinner that night, my parents talked about Ethan's new tutoring program, and Marlene discussed how they were preparing to help him get into a top grad school. And when she turned to me and asked if I even had a plan after graduation, I simply said I was working on it. And she smiled in that condescending way that suggested she already knew the outcome she believed awaited me. What she did not know was that I had already said my first real no to the entire script they had written for me, and that this quiet decision sitting in the lining of my backpack would someday lead me to a world where people saluted not just my uniform, but my competence, my judgment, and my resilience. But for now, the victory was silent exactly the way I needed it to be. Stepping onto the campus of the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs felt like crossing a quiet border into a life no one in my family imagined for me. And each morning I walked across the quad carrying my ROTC boots in one hand and textbooks in the other. I felt the weight of two futures pressing against my shoulders, one shaped entirely by my own effort and one that my family still believed ended nowhere. Training began before sunrise, and while many cadets groaned through physical drills, I found a strange relief in the predictability, because no one could twist the rules here or shift blame or tell me I was extra simply because it suited them. Instead, every task had a clear standard, and every standard had a measurable truth, and when I excelled, people acknowledged it without hesitation, which felt almost unreal after years of being dismissed. By the end of my first year, I ranked in the top tier of the battalion, and by my second year, I had climbed into the top 5%, and my instructors began to call my name during demonstrations because they trusted me to solve problems calmly even when others panicked. And this was the first time in my life where competence did not need defending. During one weekly briefing, our ROTC commander brought in a guest speaker through a teleconference screen, and the moment the camera flickered on the room, straightened since everyone recognized the face of Brigadier General Harrington, a man whose opinion carried weight across multiple bases. He spoke about leadership under pressure and communication failures turning missions into chaos, and when he opened the floor to questions, most cadets hesitated until I raised my hand and asked about real-time decision-making in environments where comms were compromised and whether junior officers were ever given room to innovate. He paused, then smiled slightly, and said that innovation was rare and invaluable, and that people who could think clearly in those moments became assets the Army did not forget, and for a split second, I felt as if he were looking directly at me through the screen. After the session, my commander clapped a hand on my shoulder and said that was the kind of question that made someone stand out, and I wrote that comment down later, not out of pride, but because no one in my family had ever said something like that to me. Eventually, commissioning day arrived, a day that felt like stepping through another threshold into a world I had earned inch by inch, and I stood in my uniform with polished brass, catching the afternoon light, ready to FaceTime my parents so they could at least witness the moment. I called twice, but both attempts went to voicemail, and a few minutes later my mother texted, "Sorry, we are at Ethan's graduation party, call later." And I stared at the message until the letters blurred because even a milestone like this could not pull their attention away from him. The ceremony continued, and when my name was called, I saluted and accepted my insignia, knowing that the pride I felt came solely from myself and the people who trained beside me, not from any applause waiting back home. Shortly after I reported to Fort Carson, where the air smelled of pine and dust, and the mountains stood like giant witnesses to every soldier who passed through, and the early years there shaped me in ways my family would never hear about. I worked under officers who expected excellence, not excuses, and I served with soldiers like Sergeant Diaz, who pushed me to think tactically, and Lieutenant Chen, who challenged me to take charge even when I felt too young to lead. And slowly, the world I moved in shifted from one where I was constantly underestimated to one where people trusted me to keep critical systems running because lives and missions depended on it. Then came the NATO exercise, a winter operation in Europe, where everything that could go wrong did go wrong, and I was assigned to lead a small team overseeing communications links between units spread across a difficult training environment. The storm that hit us was the kind that swallowed sound and direction, but my team stayed with me as I implemented a contingency network I had quietly built in the weeks prior, because something in me always planned for failure after growing up in a home where the ground could shift without warning. When the system held and the exercise was saved, our after-action review spread across the command network, and an internal bulletin was published with the headline, "Young Lieutenant Hale shows unusual composure under pressure," and suddenly officers at other bases knew my name. I sent the article home out of some lingering instinct to share good news, but Marlene replied, "Cute internal newsletter does not pay your bills, honey," and I realized in that moment that the part of me that still hoped for recognition from them needed to be put to rest. I stopped sending updates after that because my achievements deserved to live untainted by mockery, and if they had chosen not to witness who I was becoming, then they forfeited the right to join my victories. What I did not know at the time was that my performance during that operation had caught the attention of someone far above my immediate chain of command, because a week later, during a strategy session, my captain mentioned that General Harrington had reviewed our reports and remembered my name and had told his aide to keep an eye on Lieutenant Hale because she was not average. I overheard this while walking past the office door, and my breath caught because this was the same general who had once answered my question through a screen. Yet now he was aware of my work in a tangible way, and I felt something new settle into my bones, a quiet recognition that my path was widening in places my family never cared to imagine. From there, my responsibilities increased, and I was called into meetings usually reserved for officers with far more years in uniform, and although I kept my composure, I felt the shift clearly as more people began to treat me as someone whose judgment carried weight. Back home, however, nothing changed, and during one brief call, my parents asked again how life was at Fort Carson, as if I were merely working a clerical job, And when I mentioned that I had been commended by leadership, my mother said that was nice in the same tone she used when commenting on a weather report. It became obvious that the person I was becoming and the person they believed me to be would never align. They would never understand that by this point, I was already stepping into a role that would one day make a brigadier general walk straight through a crowded room in Pueblo to greet me first. By the time 2022 arrived, I had already settled into the rhythm of being a platoon leader at Fort Carson, yet nothing in Colorado truly prepared me for the brutal winter training grounds of Żagań, Poland, where the NATO exercise was set to unfold, and the cold there felt older than anything I had known, a sharp, relentless cold that crept through every layer of gear until even your thoughts shivered. Our temporary base sat on a stretch of open ground, dotted with antenna masts and generators, with multinational units spread far into the training area, waiting for our comms to keep them tethered to safety. And every day during the early briefings, I reminded myself that our work in the Signal Corps might not be glamorous, but it was the spine of the entire operation. At first, everything followed plan, with minor issues cropping up the kind you expect during a joint international exercise, but on the fourth night the sky collapsed into a storm, so violent that the wind felt like it could shear metal, and the snow turned sideways, making even the floodlights look like weak candles. I was in the comms tent reviewing outage alerts when the first alarm hit, saying one of our main antenna towers had snapped under the pressure of the storm, and within minutes the generator feeding our primary comms node began sputtering, fading in and out like a dying pulse. I stepped outside and the storm nearly knocked me back yet. Through the wind, I could hear Diaz shouting that if the generator failed entirely, we would lose the entire link to the field units, and some of them were positioned deep in forested zones where visibility was near zero. Without comms, the exercise would not just fail, it would put real people at risk, since units could become disoriented in the blizzard-like conditions, and no one could track their locations accurately. My training kicked into place, and I felt my mind become strangely clear in the chaos, and I ordered Diaz to gather 2 teams sheltering by the vehicles, then told Chen to start prepping the backup mesh network I had designed quietly weeks earlier. It had never been part of the official plan since the main system was expected to endure the weather, but something in me had insisted on building a secondary network anyway, out of lingering instincts that came from growing up in a world where things were always one misunderstanding away from falling apart. The mesh system could reroute signals through multiple small nodes, meaning that even if a tower went down or a generator failed, we could still maintain critical connections. Activating it required physical placement of nodes across the perimeter, which meant sending soldiers into the storm, but I had already mapped safe routes based on terrain reports and wind patterns. I briefed the teams quickly, and they trusted me enough to move without hesitation, disappearing into the blur of snow with equipment strapped to their backs. Inside headquarters, panic was rising, and I heard someone say, "We need to shut everything down until visibility improves," but shutting down would have stranded the units who needed us most. Diaz stepped forward, soaked from the storm, and told the room, "Ma'am Hale has a plan. She has mapped contingencies, and she knows the system better than anyone out there." And when General Harrington, who had arrived earlier that day to oversee the exercise, turned toward us, I felt a jolt of awareness, because this was the first time I had seen him in person. He asked if I believed the mesh could hold, and I told him yes, with no hesitation. And after a long moment, he nodded and said, "Then we follow Lieutenant Hale," and everyone in the room turned toward me, waiting for direction. For hours, the storm screamed around us as the mesh nodes flickered online one by one, and the generator finally died with a soft groan. Yet instead of dropping to darkness, the monitors stabilized and the comms channels lit up again with clear signals. We guided units out of dangerous pockets, tracked movement through whiteout zones, and prevented several teams from becoming stranded. And as the storm continued to rage, we kept the network alive through sheer coordination and grit. When dawn finally cracked through the winter sky, the storm easing into a heavy quiet, the exercise commander announced that the operation would proceed because comms had never fully collapsed, and that this was thanks to the signal platoon led by Lieutenant Morgan Hale. Later during the award ceremony, the multinational officers gathered under a makeshift canopy, and General Harrington pinned the medal to my uniform himself and said, "You kept us from going blind out there," and the applause that followed felt like a wave of heat against the cold morning air. I stood there absorbing the moment, yet when the event was over and we returned to the barracks, I did not call home because I already knew no one would ask how it went or what I had done, and no one would set aside their day to recognize what this meant. Instead, I went to my small room and laid the medal on the desk and stared at it, while remembering every time Marlene told me I was not enough, and every time my parents chose silence over support, and I lifted the medal and held it to the dim overhead light, thinking they told me I would never be enough. Yet someone else decided I was essential. The story spread faster than I expected, moving from internal reports to an Army Times piece that highlighted the use of the backup network and praised our quick response under extreme weather conditions, and soon units across different commands began referring to the event as the time Hale saved our eyes, because without visualization and comms, the entire force would have moved blind. Social media pages dedicated to military leadership reposted the article, and within weeks, I received invitations to speak on panels about adaptive problem solving for junior officers. Meanwhile, my family remained comfortably unaware, and none of them ever asked why I had been gone so long or what I had accomplished, and a part of me realized this was not tragic, but freeing, because their lack of interest meant my achievements no longer belonged to them, even in concept. They lived in a world where my uniform was a cute costume and my service a hobby. Yet far from them, I had become someone whose decisions shaped the actions of dozens of soldiers and influenced the trust of a general who would one day walk straight toward me in a crowded reunion hall without looking at anyone else first, simply because he knew who I was, even if my family never cared to learn. Coming home after the deployment felt strange, because Pueblo looked exactly the same with its familiar dry wind and quiet streets. Yet I felt like someone who had lived two separate lives, and only one of them was visible to the people waiting behind the front door of my parents' house. When I walked into the living room, the old television hummed in the corner, and the same stack of magazines sat on the coffee table as if time had politely stepped aside for everyone. But me and my mother hugged me briefly before turning back to a tray of snacks she was arranging for the family gathering that evening. My father asked how the flight was without looking away from the sports channel, and even though I had just returned from coordinating comms for an international military exercise, the kind that tested every fiber of my judgment, I knew better than to expect a single question about what I had accomplished. By the time everyone arrived, the house was buzzing with talk about Ethan, who had apparently started a job at a bank and was preparing to buy a house, and Marlene practically floated from person to person, repeating that he was their real success story, as if she were launching him into orbit with her enthusiasm. I sat on the couch listening to relatives praise his future while I sipped warm soda from a paper cup, and when someone finally turned to me and asked what Eastern Europe was like, I opened my mouth to answer, only for Marlene to wave a hand and say, "Anyway, can you fix our Wi-Fi? It has been dropping Netflix all week," and her tone carried the same dismissive certainty she had used on me since childhood. The room shifted instantly, because no matter what uniform I wore outside this house, inside I was still the convenient helper the person called upon to plug in devices and troubleshoot problems no one else wanted to understand. I set my drink down and followed her to the hallway, where the aging router sat blinking unhappily on a narrow shelf, and it took less than 3 minutes to diagnose and repair the issue, because my entire career had been built on systems far more complicated than a dusty at-home network. When the signal returned, Marlene clapped lightly and announced, "See, she is good with cables, that is something." And the way she said something made it sound like a consolation prize rather than the truth, which was that I kept soldiers alive by making sure their communications never failed. Ethan overheard and chuckled while telling a relative that it must be nice to have someone in the family who can do free tech support, and I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the old reminder that to them I existed primarily as a utility, not a person whose skills carried actual weight. Later that afternoon, while the house emptied out and neighbors lingered in the driveway, I overheard Marlene tell one of them that I helped with their tech, sometimes the same way she might talk about a teenager mowing lawns for pocket change. And without thinking too hard, I realized I was tired of letting her rewrite my value because she assumed no one would challenge the story she told. That evening, after returning to my parents' place, I drafted a simple email to her, attaching a cleanly formatted invoice modeled after what local contractors charged for home IT consultation, listing diagnostics, network repair, and labor duration. And even though I had no intention of taking her money, I wanted her to see her request the way a stranger would interpret it. I hit send and went to bed, feeling the faint pulse of satisfaction that comes from reclaiming a boundary quietly. The next morning, my phone rang, and before I could say hello, Marlene demanded to know why she had received a bill and insisted that family does not charge family and accused me of acting ungrateful after everything they had done. I listened calmly, and when she paused to breathe, I said I assumed my work was not important and that you only see value when it is free. And there was a long silence on the line before she snapped something incoherent and hung up. The tiny revenge was not meant to humiliate her. It was simply a mirror reflecting how she had treated me for years, and I knew she had not recognized it because she only understood narratives where she was the generous one and I was the background character. My parents asked why she was upset, but when I explained the situation, their expressions faltered into the familiar blend of discomfort and avoidance, and they reminded me that Marlene meant well even when she spoke harshly, because that was just her way, and I wondered how many years of my life had been shaped by that excuse. Despite the tension, the rest of my leave passed quietly with moments that felt almost normal, like sitting on the back porch, listening to the sound of cicadas, and watching the sun drop behind the silhouette of the mountains. Yet even during the calm, I felt the distance widening between who I was to them and who I actually had become. They saw the same quiet girl who held coats at family parties and fixed whatever was broken in the house, and they did not see the officer trusted with decisions that affected dozens of soldiers in the field. They did not see the reports written by commanders who respected my leadership or the medal that glinted from the corner of my rucksack because I chose not to display it on their shelf. They did not see the potential that General Harrington himself had recognized and carried forward with deliberate trust. And I realized something else as I packed my bags to return to base, that the small revenge, the invoice, the reflection of worthiness had been less about teaching Marlene anything and more about reminding myself that my time, energy, and expertise held real measurable value in the world, even if the people who raised me refused to acknowledge it. The trip home ended without ceremony, and when my mother hugged me goodbye, she said, "Be safe, honey," in the same distracted tone she used when reminding my father to pick up milk from the store. I got into my car and looked back at the house where I had spent my entire childhood feeling unseen, and a quiet conviction settled into me that I could love them and still walk away from the version of myself they insisted I remain. I drove back toward Fort Carson, where the mountains rose like anchors of strength, and I felt the shift in my chest, the understanding that the next time my family tried to box me into the role they preferred, they would find that I had grown far beyond the edges they set. Spring at Fort Carson always carried a restless energy as soldiers moved between trainings and briefings and early promotions. And as I settled back into the rhythm of office work and late-night planning sessions after my leave in Pueblo, I felt something shifting inside me, something quiet but definite, as if the girl who once stayed silent at family gatherings had finally stepped aside for the woman who understood the weight of her own authority. I was reviewing a network readiness report when the email notification appeared on my screen with the subject, "Hail Family Reunion, July 4th weekend," and for a moment I just stared at it. because reunions were the kind of events where my presence usually meant little more than another pair of hands setting up folding chairs. When I opened the message, it was a cheerful announcement about balloons and barbecue and patriotic decorations, and I could almost hear the tone my family would use to talk about the event as if the 4th of July were their stage to perform unity. A few minutes later, my phone rang and my mother's voice filled the line with a kind of hopeful brightness as she said it would mean a lot if I came and that my aunt had been telling everyone how proud she was of me. And the words landed strangely because pride had never been part of the vocabulary she used with me. After we hung up, I opened the group chat where the reunion planning had been happening and scrolled through lines of messages until I reached one from Marlene that said, "Hopefully, our little soldier actually shows up this time and does not act too dramatic," and the familiar twist worked its way under my ribs like it always had, yet this time, I did not swallow it the way I once learned to do. Instead, I leaned back in my chair and wondered how many stories she had spun about me while I was coordinating comms in a snowstorm on the other side of the world. Later that evening, while I sat with my laptop at the small cafe just outside the barracks, I reread a thread that one of my cousins had forwarded to me privately. A thread where Marlene had been telling extended family that I had been sent overseas mostly because of quota diversity rather than competence, and I felt the heat rising in my chest, but not anger, rather a strange, cool clarity. Years ago, her words would have made me question my worth. But now, they only exposed how little she understood about the world I moved in. The next morning, I mentioned it to Sergeant Diaz while we walked from the motor pool toward the office, and he stopped in his tracks, shaking his head with a low whistle and said, "If they want to build their own version of your life, let them. But sooner or later, the truth walks into the room whether they invite it or not." Then he paused and snapped his fingers as if remembering something important and said that General Harrington was scheduled to attend a National Guard community outreach event in Pueblo on the 4th of July weekend, meaning he would be only a building away from my family reunion. The idea struck me fully formed in a single breath, and my thoughts aligned with the precision of a comms diagram as I considered a simple question: what would happen if someone who knew exactly who I was stepped into the same room as the people who insisted I was nothing? It was not spite that shaped the plan, but rather a quiet desire to stop defending myself against lies when the truth had more authority than any argument I could make. That afternoon in my office, I drafted a polite email to the General's aide, explaining that my family's reunion was being held next to the local event space on the same day, and that if the General had even a minute to say hello, I would be honored. I finished the message with no pressure, of course, because respect mattered in our world, and I clicked send, without overthinking. Hours later, the aide replied that the General remembered me well, and that if his schedule allowed, he would swing by, which was military speak for a tentative yes, and as I read the message, a slow, steady current of anticipation moved through me. I did not tell my parents or Marlene or anyone in the group chat. Instead, I let their assumptions remain untouched while I continued to scroll through their messages about potluck dishes and flag-themed decorations and reminders about arrival time. They talked about me as if I were a distant afterthought, and when someone asked in the chat whether I was coming, Marlene replied, "I hope she does, but we will see she gets sensitive and dramatic and might decide not to show." I set my phone down and allowed myself one long breath, because the old version of me would have felt wounded, but the woman who had kept NATO comms alive through a blizzard felt no sting at all. She simply felt ready. Later, as I walked back to my barracks with the mountains sharp against the fading orange sky, I mulled over the email one more time and imagined the expression on Marlene's face if General Harrington did indeed enter the room and greet me first. The thought was not about revenge in the loud theatrical sense. It was about truth stepping forward without me having to say a word. My family had spent years writing a narrative that made them comfortable, one where I was small, unremarkable extra, as she liked to say. But people who worked with me every day had built an entirely different understanding of who Lieutenant Hale was, and it felt like the two stories were headed for a collision. That night, I sat on my bunk with my boots neatly beside the bed and reread the aide's message that ended with, "We will try," and I whispered to myself, if they want to keep telling the story that I am nothing, then fine, let us see what happens when someone who knows the real version walks into the room. The parking lot outside the Pueblo Community Center shimmered under the July sun as I stepped out of my car and adjusted the collar of my uniform, feeling the familiar weight of my rank settle against my shoulders like a steadying hand, and even though the reunion banner flapped cheerfully above the entrance, I sensed the tension waiting inside the moment I heard the murmur of family voices drifting through the open doors. When I walked into the hall, the air smelled of barbecue and sugary lemonade, and country music played from a small speaker near the buffet table as people moved casually between the folding chairs. But the second a few relatives caught sight of my uniform, they let out soft, surprised wows as if seeing me properly for the first time. The attention lasted only 2 seconds before Marlene swooped in with the precision of someone who refused to let a spotlight rest anywhere but where she wanted it. And she said loudly, "Do not crowd her. She loves attention." And her voice carried across the tables with that familiar cutting sweetness that always made it impossible for anyone to compliment me without feeling foolish. I gave the polite smile I had perfected over years of gatherings and found a seat near the end of a table where people were passing around bowls of potato salad and talking about holiday plans. And I tried to blend into the flow of conversation, even though the fabric of my uniform never let me quite disappear. A cousin leaned in and asked, "So what do you actually do over there?" And I answered simply that I worked in signal communications, making sure people could talk in conditions where talking mattered most. Before the words even settled, Marlene cut through with a sharp, bright laugh, saying, "So she is basically the family Wi-Fi," and the entire table erupted with amused chuckles, as if reducing my career to a household convenience were the most natural joke in the world. I swallowed the heat rising in my chest, because calm was my currency now, and I refused to let her see even a flicker of discomfort. So I focused on my plate, while conversations resumed around me about sports games and real estate and Ethan's upcoming wedding. After a while, I stood to refill my drink, and as I passed the corner near the drink station, I heard Marlene's voice again, softer now yet laced with the same smug assurance she always used when speaking to relatives who trusted her implicitly. She was talking to an older aunt and saying, "We took her out of the will for her own good. Soldiers die young. You know better to keep the house and money with stable people like Ethan." And the words struck me like a slow, heavy blow rather than a sharp one, because they confirmed something I had sensed for years but had never heard spoken aloud. It was not just that they underestimated me or dismissed me. It was that they had already decided I had no place in the future of this family, and they felt entitled to shape the narrative as if it were an act of mercy. I stood frozen for a moment, absorbing the sting of it before stepping away so neither of them would notice I had heard. A little later, when I approached my mother near the dessert table, I asked gently whether it was true. And Linda's eyes darted away before she murmured that Marlene thinks it is safer that way. Her voice thin and wavering as if she were reciting a line she'd been given rather than speaking her own thoughts, and the familiar ache of being second to everyone else pressed against my ribs. I looked at her and realized that even now she did not see me clearly. She only saw the shadow Marlene had painted for years, and she had never questioned it, because questioning required courage she rarely exercised. I returned to my seat as the room bustled with laughter and clinking cups, and yet there was a growing sense of distance around me, as if I were observing the gathering through a pane of glass, and Marlene seemed to sense the moment my internal footing shifted because she approached with a satisfied lift of her chin and scanned my uniform from collar to boots before leaning in just enough for nearby relatives to hear. She said with deliberate slowness, "Uniforms do not make you important out here. You are just the extra seat," and the sentence settled over the room like a hush, even though no one acknowledged it openly. In her voice, I heard every dismissal she had ever spoken and every lie she had spun about my worth, and something inside me quieted into an almost serene stillness, the kind of stillness that came from years of carrying the weight of their story and finally realizing I no longer had to hold it. I did not respond because any reaction would have been a reward she did not deserve. Instead, I held her gaze just long enough for her to blink, and then I looked away, as if she were nothing more than another passing comment in a room full of noise. But before I could take a breath, I heard the unmistakable sound of boots on polished floor, coming from behind me, firm, measured steps that did not belong to any civilian, and the voices around me softened into curious murmurs. The door at the back of the hall groaned open, letting in a streak of bright afternoon light, and though I did not turn yet, I felt the shift, the subtle electric tension that rippled through the crowd as someone important crossed the threshold. My pulse steadied, and the corners of my mind sharpened into anticipation, because I knew the pattern of that stride and the energy it carried, and I also knew that without lifting a single finger, I was standing at the edge of the moment where every lie told about me would unravel in front of the very people who had woven them. I kept my eyes ahead, letting the suspense gather in the space between one breath and the next, and the room waited with me, balanced on the thin line, separating humiliation from impact. The footsteps behind me grew clearer, and the bright strip of sunlight from the doorway stretched farther across the floor, as if the entire room were being pulled toward whatever presence had just stepped inside, and conversations faltered until the soft hum of country music was the only steady sound. I kept my posture steady, my gaze fixed ahead, because I understood that turning around too soon would break the fragile quiet rising through the hall, and after years of being talked over, sidelined and minimized, I wanted this moment to unfold with the slow, deliberate certainty that truth always carried. The first voices to react were from a group of cousins near the drink table who whispered, "Is that a soldier or something?" But the tone changed instantly when a second figure walked in, wearing a uniform that carried unmistakable authority, and someone near the buffet gasped, "Is that a general?" Chairs scraped as people shifted for a better view, and even without looking, I felt the weight of familiarity settle into the air, like a signal pattern I had decoded 1,000 times. When I finally turned my head slightly, I saw two junior officers enter, first scanning the room to make space before Brigadier General Harrington stepped forward, his presence absorbing whatever noise remained until the hall felt pinned in place. The general's eyes swept the crowd politely, but with the practiced precision of someone accustomed to discerning the point of relevance in any room. And when his gaze reached me, it stopped with the ease of recognition, and something like pride flickered across his expression. Without acknowledging anyone else, he began walking directly toward my table, and the crowd responded with instinctive deference, parting for him, despite not knowing who he was, because authority speaks before a person opens their mouth. Marlene watched him approach, with confusion tightening her face, as if she were trying to calculate how someone like him had wandered into a family reunion and whether he was searching for someone important. She glanced toward Ethan, expecting perhaps a connection she could claim, but the general did not slow until he reached me, and the corners of his mouth lifted in a warm, composed smile. "Lieutenant Hale did not expect to see you off duty today," he said, and his voice carried across the hall with the kind of clarity that silenced whatever whispering remained. I rose smoothly, offering a salute and a respectful handshake, and his returning grip was strong, steady, confirming a mutual trust built far from this place, where people still believed I was the extra seat at the table. He turned to the people around me, his tone shifting into something almost gentle as he asked, "You must be her people." And before anyone could answer, he continued, "She is the reason our exercise in Zagan did not fall apart when things went sideways. Your girl held the line." The silence that followed was thick, stretching across every face at that table, but none froze more completely than Marlene, whose mouth parted in a stunned half-breath. The same woman who had declared only minutes earlier that uniforms did not make me important, now stood confronted with a truth delivered by someone whose rank alone rewrote the entire room. Then one of the junior officers stepped closer, as if remembering something, and said, "Sir, is she not also on the short list for that Joint Service Award?" And all eyes widened, because awards of that level did not come up in casual conversation, especially not in a community center during a family barbecue. General Harrington nodded without hesitation. "She's one of the youngest we have ever put up," and he said it plainly as if announcing the time of day, and yet the impact on the room was seismic. A hush spread so deep I could hear a fork drop onto a paper plate across the hall, and I watched Marlene's face drain of color as each word dismantled the narrative she had woven for years. She had spent my entire life painting me as average, unremarkable, forgettable, and now the highest-ranking person in the building was contradicting her with simple, unquestionable fact. The general continued speaking, addressing my parents directly. "If you ever wonder whether what she does matters, ask the units that did not lose comms that night, and the implications settled over them like a weight. Because for the first time in my life, someone with undeniable authority was putting into language what I had never needed to brag about, that my work held real consequences, that my leadership carried real impact, and that what I did could not be minimized to Wi-Fi jokes and dismissive shrugs." My father murmured something like, "I did not know," and my mother's eyes flickered with a stunned awe that bordered on disbelief, because in their world, success was loud, ostentatious. Something you bragged about at reunions, not something earned quietly in the middle of a storm in Eastern Europe. They had never imagined that the daughter they brushed aside had been shaping outcomes they could not comprehend. The general checked his watch politely, but lingered long enough to ensure the message sank in, and then he looked at me with the same steady confidence he had shown on the day he pinned my medal. "We will see you at the ceremony in Washington Hale. Bring your family if they want to see what important looks like." He said, his tone composed, but his words carrying a deliberate echo that struck at the exact sentence Marlene had thrown at me hours earlier. I met his gaze with a respectful nod because no response was needed beyond gratitude, and when he stepped away, the room erupted into a scatter of nervous laughs, awkward throat clears, and sudden attempts at conversation, but nothing could mask the shift that had occurred. The balance of the entire evening had tilted in a single moment, and every person in that hall now understood that the story they had been told about me did not match the person I had become. I glanced at Marlene, who stood rigid, clutching a paper cup and pretending to examine a decoration on the wall, but her eyes darted toward me with something close to panic, because the truth had finally outrun her narrative, and no amount of correction or spin could put it back. I did not say anything to her because I did not need to. The room had already spoken. In the week that followed the reunion, the shock in the community seemed to ripple outward in small, unpredictable waves, and even though I returned to Fort Carson and slipped back into the routine of morning briefings and late afternoon runs, my phone kept lighting up with fragments of conversations from Pueblo where people were still talking about the moment General Harrington walked into a family gathering as if it were a scene from a movie they did not know they had bought tickets to. I stayed quiet partly because silence had once been forced on me, but now it was a choice, and a strategic one, as I let the truth settle in the spaces Marlene had filled with her stories for years. Then one afternoon, while I sat in the small break area scrolling through emails, I saw her name pop up on Facebook, and curiosity nudged me to open the notification. There on her profile was a photo she had taken at the reunion showing the back corner of the hall with my uniform barely visible in the background, and beneath it she had written the caption, "So proud of my niece in uniform today. We have always supported her journey," followed by a flurry of heart emojis and flag icons, and even though I should not have been surprised, the audacity of it still washed over me in a wave of disbelief, because for her, the truth was always something bendable, as long as the performance looked good enough to fool the audience she wanted to impress. Comments poured in from church friends and neighbors cheering her on for being such a supportive aunt and saying how wonderful it must be to have a soldier in the family, and I felt the old, familiar pressure in my chest, but this time it did not tighten. It sharpened. I stared at the post for a long moment, thinking of the sentence she flung at me with such confidence: uniforms do not make you important out here, you are just the extra seat. And then I thought of General Harrington telling the room that I had held the line in Zagan and shaped the outcome of an entire exercise, and something inside me clicked into place with quiet precision. I typed a single comment. Not angry, not dramatic, simply factual, the way a clean report reads funny. 10 minutes before General Harrington walked in, you told me uniforms do not make me important and that I am just an extra seat. But thanks for the post, and I hit send before I could reconsider, because truth did not need polishing, it only needed daylight. Within minutes, the comment began collecting reactions, and the tone of the entire thread shifted as if someone had pulled a rug from under a staged performance. A distant cousin replied, "Wait, what happened?" And a neighbor wrote, "Is this true?" And a woman from church who always posted inspirational verses added, "I remember hearing something like that at the reunion," and suddenly the narrative Marlene had been crafting for years began to fissure in real time. As more people read the thread side, conversations broke off into private messages, including one to me from a woman named Carol, who attended the same congregation as Marlene, and she asked kindly, "I do not want to pry, but did she really say that to you? Because it does not match what she tells all of us." And I simply responded, "Yes, she did." The message hung there, unembellished, unsoftened, and that was enough. By midweek, several relatives had reached out expressing surprise and quiet discomfort because they had long accepted Marlene's portrayal of me as distant and ungrateful and unimpressive. But now they had seen a general cross a room just to greet me, and they were beginning to ask themselves why none of her stories aligned with what they witnessed. At the Sunday service that followed, I was not present, but I heard from my cousin Ava that Marlene tried to retell the reunion moment as if she and I shared a warm, respectful bond, and that the general's praise reflected the family's long-standing support of my career. But apparently someone in the pew behind her interrupted with a gentle but pointed question, asking, "Did you not say some pretty rough things to her before he arrived?" And the room went awkwardly quiet because church communities in small cities may avoid direct conflict, yet they do not ignore hypocrisy when it is laid bare in front of them. Ava said she watched Marlene stumble through half-formed explanations before retreating into a stiff smile and changing the subject, and the image of that moment played in my mind not with triumph, but with a sense of long overdue accuracy. A few days later, I received a text from Ethan's younger sister, a girl who had grown up hearing Marlene's version of me, and she wrote, "I used to believe every story Aunt Marlene told about you after the reunion. I do not." And the message struck me more deeply than I expected, because it reminded me that reclaiming the narrative was not about humiliating anyone. It was about pulling back the curtain on a long-running distortion that had shaped how people perceived me. I sat with the message for a while, letting the weight of it settle, because for so many years I had fought battles quietly believing silence was safer and easier than confrontation. But now I saw that truth had its own momentum, and once released, it traveled farther and faster than any lie constructed to contain it. Even without raising my voice, even without attending church or replying to every message, even without speaking directly to Marlene, I was reshaping what people knew about me, and more importantly, what they questioned about her, because for the first time her mask was cracking, not by my force, but by her own contradictions. I looked out the window of my barracks at the mountains catching the late afternoon light, and I felt something shift inside me, a sense of grounding, a steady recognition that I did not need to argue or justify or correct every distortion she created. All I needed to do was live in the truth I had earned and let it reveal itself in the spaces where deception once thrived. The story she told for years was collapsing, and I did not lift more than a finger to make it happen. It was late in 2024 when the call finally came, the kind of call that arrives with a silence heavy enough to warn you before a single word is spoken. And when I saw Marlene's name flash across my screen, I already knew it would not be an apology or a correction or a reflection, it would be a request, because people like her only reach for you when their world is collapsing and they need someone sturdy enough to stand in the rubble. I answered anyway, because avoiding her would not change the truth that had been unfolding since the reunion and the moment her face appeared on the screen, framed by the dim yellow light of what looked like a hospital room. I could hear the shakiness in her breathing and see her husband lying behind her with monitors blinking softly. She did not bother with small talk. She jumped straight into crisis, saying Ethan had made a disastrous investment and they were behind on their mortgage and the bank was tightening, and the house she had used as evidence of her superiority for years was suddenly at risk of slipping out from under her feet, and with every sentence she twisted the knife of desperation a little deeper until she finally said the line she must have rehearsed. "Family helps family, you wear that uniform, do you not time to be a hero where it matters?" I stayed still, letting the words settle, and it was almost fascinating how quickly she had pivoted from mocking my rank and dismissing my career to acting as if my benefits were hers by default, as if the uniform she rejected in public was a tool she could wield now that she needed something only it could provide. She explained that all she required was for me to use my VA loan to co-sign their refinance or to restructure their mortgage because the bank would trust a service member, and that this one gesture would save their home and their future. And she spoke as if the solution were simple and obvious and morally unavoidable. What she did not know was that I had seen this coming from miles away, and I had spent time with a JAG officer and the financial counselor on base, learning every regulation, every liability, every legal boundary, because if the day ever came when my uniform suddenly became useful to her, I wanted to be ready, and I was. I let her finish her pitch, then asked calmly why she thought this was something I could or should do, and she blinked as if stunned by the question, before leaning forward with a tone that mixed irritation with entitlement, saying, "Because we are family, and without help, we could lose everything, and if that happens, it will be on your conscience." The accusation hung there for a second, and then something inside me snapped into clarity. Not anger, just certainty, and I said the truth. She had spent years pretending she had the right to ignore. "You took me out of your will because soldiers die young. You said it was better to keep the house with stable people like Ethan. You made it clear I was not part of this home, so you do not get to cash in on a roof. You decided I did not belong under." Her face tightened in disbelief, because for once my refusal could not be recast as disrespect or immaturity or ingratitude. It was grounded in her own words, the ones she had thrown so carelessly at the reunion, the ones she had forgotten, everyone else remembered, including me. She tried to recover by softening her tone, saying she had never meant it that way, and that people say things when they are stressed, and that blood is thicker than whatever misunderstandings linger from the past. And I waited until she finished before saying, "I already spoke with legal. I cannot and will not co-sign for you. I cannot and will not use my benefits for you. I cannot take responsibility for debt I did not create and cannot control." Her voice rose slightly, her panic leaking through the cracks as she said, "If this house goes, we have nowhere else to go," and the guilt trip she attempted would have crushed the younger version of me, the one who thought peace was worth swallowing the truth. But I was not that girl anymore. I said quietly, "Your choices led you here, mine did not." And she stared at me stunned, as if hearing logic for the first time in her life. I ended the call politely and immediately typed an email summarizing everything we discussed, using the correct legal language and CCing my parents, because transparency was armor now. I wrote that I was not legally permitted or morally obligated to assume any portion of Marlene's mortgage, that I recommended they speak to a credit counselor or attorney, and that I would not be involved in any financial arrangements moving forward. And when I hit send, I felt a relief sharper and deeper than I expected. An hour later, my mother called, her voice soft but edged, as she said, "Maybe you could have helped a little," and I closed my eyes because I knew this moment would come, the moment when emotional responsibility attempted to override reality. I answered slowly, choosing each word with care. I almost died on a foreign training ground to give people second chances. I do not owe them a third one at the cost of my future. There was a long silence on the line, the kind that stretches across years of unspoken truths, and when she finally murmured, "I understand," I knew she understood only part of it, not all, but enough for now. As I hung up the phone, I felt the shift that comes when a long pattern finally breaks, because for the first time in my life I had said no, without apology, without guilt, and without fear, and the world did not collapse around me. Theirs did. A few months passed quietly after that call, and if there was one thing I learned during those weeks, it was that silence has a way of revealing the truth more clearly than confrontation ever could. Because little by little, the consequences of choices Marlene had insisted were harmless began to collect around her like dust, settling on furniture no one had touched in years. And the first sign came when I heard from my mother that the bank had officially moved forward with the foreclosure notice, then that the house Marlene had bragged about at every holiday gathering was going on the market at a loss, and finally that she and her husband were packing what they could into a rented truck headed to a smaller neighborhood on the far side of town where no one hosted charity luncheons or 4th of July barbecues, and the image of her stepping into a place without room for all her pride felt strangely quiet rather than triumphant. I did not interfere. I did not celebrate. I did not even speak it aloud because I knew the collapse was not because of me. It was simply the logical end of years of entitlement and storytelling and denial, and now she had to live in a reality that did not bend around her preferences anymore. A week later, my mother called again, sounding unsettled, as she said a neighbor from the old block had asked her whether it was true that Marlene's niece served in the army, because they thought someone in the military would be helping them get back on their feet. And I could almost hear the shift in her voice when she realized how absurd that expectation sounded, spoken out loud, and how deeply Marlene had depended on the illusion that I would be her safety net, even after she spent years cutting at that net thread by thread. My mother did not defend Marlene this time. She only said she was tired and that everything felt heavier than it used to. And for the first time, I sensed she was beginning to understand not the full story yet, but enough to see that this downfall belonged to Marlene alone and not to the scapegoat she had been shaping me into since I was a child. A few days later, my cousin sent me a long message that began with, "I am mad at my parents, not you," and continued with a quiet confession that he had believed every story Marlene told about me until the reunion, when he saw her face crumble under the weight of the truth spilling from General Harrington's mouth. And he wrote that he finally understood. I had never abandoned the family. I had only escaped the version of it that Marlene controlled, and that realization took him months to swallow. I sat with that message for a long time because it was the first time anyone in that branch of the family had acknowledged the cost of staying small just to make someone else appear larger. And in that moment, the years of being dismissed and twisted and blamed felt like a page turning rather than a bruise reopening. When I eventually sat down with my parents, I realized they too had been quietly reckoning with their part in the harm, because my father looked older than I remembered, and my mother kept her hands folded as if bracing for impact, and I knew it was time to lay everything down without softening it. I told them the truth about the night Marlene hit me and blamed me for it. The truth about the insults she filtered through them as if they were harmless observations. The truth about how they had allowed her narrative to define me more than my actions ever had. And the truth about how exhausting it had been to grow up as the child who existed only in the shadow of a more convenient story. They listened without interrupting, and when I finished, My father swallowed hard before saying, "We removed you from the will because Marlene said it was for the best. We never asked what you wanted," and the quiet shame in his voice felt heavier than anger ever had. I took a breath and said, "Good now, you are free to put me back or not, but if you do, it will be based on who I actually am, not on who she told you I was. I do not live for your paperwork anymore." And the stillness that followed felt like the first moment of honesty we had shared in years. My mother reached for my hand but did not grab it. She simply asked what I needed from them going forward, and for the first time, the answer felt clear and solid. I said, "If you want a relationship with me, you cannot call me the extra child anymore. You cannot repeat Marlene's words as if they are facts. You cannot treat my life as a story she is allowed to edit." And they both nodded slowly, as if realizing how long I had been carrying something they never bothered to examine. In the weeks after that conversation, the shift only grew more visible because without my participation, the family patterns began to collapse on their own weight, and what had once been a hierarchy built around Marlene's dominance became a loose scattering of people trying to make sense of their own choices. My parents started asking me questions about my work out of genuine curiosity rather than obligation, and my cousin reached out regularly with updates on his own attempts to separate from the emotional manipulation he had grown up around. And through all of it, I stayed steady in the background, watching from a distance, rather than stepping in to fix or cushion anything. The most surprising realization came quietly one morning as I sat in my office at Fort Carson reviewing communication plans when I received an email from the housing office confirming that I was approved for a new on-post apartment, a space that symbolized stability earned rather than borrowed. And as I read the message, I understood fully that I had never needed to destroy Marlene's influence. It simply disintegrated the moment I refused to hold it up anymore. By choosing not to save her, I had saved myself, and by stepping out of the path of her collapse, I had finally stepped into my own life. By the time 2025 arrived, I felt a steadiness in myself that I had never known growing up in that house in Pueblo. And when the email came announcing my selection for promotion to captain, I read it twice then, once more, slowly letting the reality of it settle into my bones, because everything I had carried as a child, all the names, all the doubts, all the ways I had been told I was less than had somehow shaped itself into a path I had followed with my own 2 feet. And now that path was leading me to a ceremony that would mark a milestone. People twice my age fought their entire careers to reach. I invited my parents because I wanted them to see who I had become outside the shadow of Marlene's voice, but I did not extend the same invitation to her, and it was not out of spite. It was simply clarity, a quiet acceptance that not everyone who shares your blood deserves a front-row seat to your becoming. The morning of the ceremony, the sky over Fort Carson was clear and sharp, the kind of bright, crisp Colorado morning that makes the flags outside the headquarters snap cleanly in the wind. And as I walked into the hall lined with chairs and polished floors and rows of uniforms, I felt a pulse of pride rise in my chest, not loud but deep, as if my younger self were standing beside me whispering, "Finally they see what you always knew you could be." My parents sat near the front, and when I caught my mother's eye, she looked at me in a way I had never seen before, not expectant, not doubtful, but almost reverent, and my father straightened in his seat as if trying to absorb the weight of the moment with me. When General Harrington stepped to the podium, his voice carried easily across the room, and he spoke about leadership and composure under pressure and the standard we set for those who come after us. Then he called my name, and I stepped forward as every conversation that had once diminished me melted into silence behind me. He pinned the new rank onto my uniform with steady hands and said, "At 28, Captain Hale has accomplished what many take decades to do," and the applause that rose around us felt like a wave cresting over years of being overlooked and underestimated. Afterward, we moved outside for photos. the sun bright against the mountains, and soldiers gathered around me with easy smiles and congratulations, while my parents hovered close taking pictures and laughing in a relieved, almost tender way, as if they finally understood this world I had built without them. I was posing for a photo with a few of my teammates when I heard a voice cut sharply through the afternoon air. A voice I knew too well saying, "Come on, let's get a picture." Proud aunt of a captain, and there she was, Marlene, dressed in her best church outfit, pushing her way forward as if this moment belonged to her. My breath did not catch my hands, did not shake. I felt only a calm that came from knowing she no longer had the power to shape the narrative, and I turned slightly and said to the military police standing nearby, "She is not on my guest list." The guard nodded politely, stepping between us and asking her to move to the public area outside the VIP boundary, and she tried to protest, lifting her chin, insisting "Im family," as if that alone were enough to erase everything that had led us here. But I met her gaze and said in a voice steady enough to still the air, "You told me uniforms don't make me important. You don't get to use mine now." Something in her expression flickered a brief, stunned silence. Then a frantic frustration as she realized no one in this space was going to bend to her voice. Not the soldiers, not the officers, not even my parents who stood behind me saying nothing because they finally understood the truth in front of them. The guard gently guided her back toward the public viewing section where she stood at the fence, watching me finish taking photos, laughing with my peers, and hugging my parents. And for the first time in decades, the power she once held over me evaporated like mist in the sun, leaving nothing behind but the quiet understanding that I had outgrown every version of myself she had tried to confine. The ceremony wound down and I slipped away to my apartment overlooking the Rockies, the sky turning amber behind the peaks, and I hung my new rank on the wall beside a framed photo from the exercise in Poland, and another with General Harrington and my team, all of us smiling in that raw, exhausted, triumphant way soldiers do when they know exactly what they survived together. There were no family portraits here, no traces of Marlene, no ghosts of the girl who grew up learning to shrink herself to fit inside someone else's comfort. And as I stood in that golden light, the room felt like the first place that belonged entirely to me. I thought about every time I had been told I was extra or not enough, or too difficult or too ambitious, and how those words had once pressed into me like fingerprints leaving bruises. But now they felt distant, like echoes from a life I no longer lived. And I realized that the story had never been about proving Marlene wrong. It had always been about proving to myself that her voice was never the one that defined me. I poured a glass of water, sat by the window, and let the stillness wrap around me, and somewhere between the fading sunlight and the hum of the bass settling into evening, I found a quiet truth rising inside me, and it sounded like freedom. They told me I was extra. It turns out I was the backbone of something they will never see, and that is okay. If you have ever had to build a life your own family didn't respect, you're not alone. Tell me where you're watching from, and if you're finally ready to put yourself first.